All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Artist Secrets Revealed. My name is Jennifer Droblyen, and I'm a community arts specialist for Arlington County Parks and Rec. Today, we're going to talk about 18th century Romanticism. When you think about the word, romantics, you think of, things that are like Cupid and declarations of love. Well, Romanticism was a little bit more dark and deep than that. And it was more about passion and sensitivity and using artists' imaginations to create these very almost surreal, but billowy and dreamlike sort of landscape. So my cover picture here is a painting by Caspar David Friedrich called Wanderer Above Sea of Fog. And if you look at this painting, it's this gentleman who's at the top of this precipice of this mountain, and he's looking into this beautiful landscape. And if you see, like, there's not a whole lot of realism in this image. You've got the man in the front, or right in the center, and then the landscape almost just is taken on in his entire periphery. And you can see that all of those mountains and things that are up above the fog almost are invented. And it's true, he didn't really use an actual landscape that he was painting in front of, but he was using his imagination to paint this. So that's sort of this is my sort of my core image. And I just kind of want you to remember that Romanticism is about taking, the artists and using their imagination to bring upon certain ideas. So that's his work. So just to readdress, so Romanticism is a movement that started at the end of the 1700s and reached its peak in early to mid 1850s. It marked the end of the Baroque movement and was followed by realism. So this was really a time period when we left the last Secrets Revealed. We were talking about the Dutch Golden Age, and that was in the 1600s. So this is almost a full century and a half later. So Romantic art, again, focused on emotions, feelings, and themes, including spirituality, imagination, mystery, and fervor. The subject matter varied widely, including religion, landscapes, revolution, and peace. The brushwork over time became looser and less precise. And back to that painting of Caspar von Friedrichs. And basically he said, the artist's feelings is his law. Okay, so here's where we are in our timeline of art history, European art. So if you go and you see where my little blue quote is circled here, where it says Romanticism, late 18th, mid 19th century, that's where we're at. And if you go a little bit backwards, you can kind of see where we started was in Renaissance art. So we talked about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and we moved on into the Baroque period with Rembrandt and Vermeer. And now what we're doing is we're going to talk a little bit more about these folks that are in the in-betweens from the 18th century into probably I'd say mid 19th century, so like 1850s. And this is the time where we had Turner and Deliqua, and that's who we're going to talk about today. And then soon after, you've got the realists that are going to come after, and that's where we pick up with Degas and Manet and Atkins. So we're almost there. We're almost to modernism. So just to give you a sense of, in context, what was going on in history at the time of the Romantics, we had in the 1700s, you had pretty much the Enlightenment period. A lot of the paintings were very classically painted. not necessarily, it was all very straightforward. It was kind of a boring time. That's why I didn't really want to go backwards and do classicism, because it really was just very straightforward, formal painting. And you had the Enlightenment, and you also had the start of, in the 1750s, you had the start of the Industrial Revolution. So you have in 1775 in our continent, the American Revolution broke out. And then in 1789, the French Revolution began in France, and you'll see a lot of influence in the paintings that we're going to show you today. And then, of course, this was the Reign of Terror time. So we had Napoleon had come in and defeated Spain, and you're gonna see some influence there. And you've got Mexican. We're not talking about we'll talk a little bit about American art, but not this session, and definitely not Mexico, and then the Latin Americans. That's gonna be for another day. But the Mexico declares independence in 1821. So there was a lot of things going on. There were revolutions that were sweeping Europe in the mid 1800s. And then Civil War here ended in 1865. So a lot of things were happening. There was a lot of war, a lot of fighting, and artists were really capturing and expressing their views through their paintings. Also, it was a time of great music. So classical music was really sort of the the soundtrack of this time. And so you have Beethoven and Schubert and Mozart. Those guys were, this was the time of the classical music. And then again, a little picture on the right just reminds me that the Industrial Revolution was really heavy at this point. So 1750s into the almost to the 1900s. You have your Industrial Revolution. Okay, so the four that we're going to focus on today is William Blake, Joseph Turner, Francisco de Goya, and Eugene Deliqua. So as you can see, they were all born in the 1700s, mid to late 1700s, and they lived into into the mid 18th century or 19th century. So let's start with William Blake. William Blake was born in 1757 and lived to 1827. How to identify a William Blake painting, he was also a printmaker, but how to identify his work? He was reverent of the Bible, but hostile to the Church of England, in almost to all forms of organized religion. So a lot of your work that you'll see from him is very much, it's very dreamlike, but it didn't start out that way. So let's take a look. So he's really well known for his watercolors and his etchings. This was a painting of Newton done in 1795. Done with, it's a color print with pen and ink and watercolor. This depicts Newton as divine geometer. So he was revered back in those times, just to show the strength of man, as this guy is looking at his tool here to kind of figure out where he is in existence. But if you look, it says here that he's fixing his eye on a compass and to write upon a scroll that seems to project from his own head. So it's just showing the strength of man and man's intelligence. But if you look at the musculature, it's almost, it's borderline abstraction. You can see all this muscle tone and stuff, but there's a lot of tone and a lot of tendons and a lot of muscles that really don't belong there. And you can kind of see too, like where he's seated, this craggy rock, you can kind of see all these little things within it. So he really he would give you something literal, but then he would sort of almost decorate it in a way that there were things in there that didn't make sense, but you can kind of see like little, there's like a lion face in there. There's a bunch of little, those two little things at the bottom almost look like they're maybe like some feathery creatures. And then the way his foot is exposed, let's see, that would be his left foot. Underneath that rock, it almost looks like his body is part of the rock. So there was a little bit of liberties taken. So he also liked to do a lot of dreamscapes and fairies and all sorts of just creatures. And at this time, he was friends with Thomas Paine. So he was, William Blake was very multi-talented. He was a poet. He was a painter. He was a visionary. And again, he was friends with Thomas Paine. And during the time of the American and the French revolutions, he really, really embraced the idea of what you see behind your eyes and not what you see in front of you with this war and this strife that was going on. And then you have, as he further evolved into his style, he would create creatures, and his friends would egg him on. They would say, if you're seeing ghosts and if you're seeing apparitions and you're seeing these things, show us what you're looking at. Tell us what you're seeing. And so he made a really good attempt at creating these creatures and these figures that almost were mythical. And this one was called Ghost of a Flea. And it was painted, it's very small. It's only pretty much 6 by 8.5 inches. And it was tempera painted on a type of a hardwood panel. So his later works showed real deep philosophical and spiritual themes, along with some, contemporary commentary. So he was considered one of the most creative artists in history at that time. Okay, we're going to go through several, so bear with me, buckle in. All right, so Joseph Turner. Joseph Turner, how to identify his work? Well, his work is all about forces of nature and the Industrial Revolution. So forces of nature plus the Industrial Revolution equals Turner's work. And I'll give you some examples here. He was most known for his landscapes and his marine paintings and his watercolor work. And he's known to the conservators as a complete nightmare because his work was, he used mixed media in his pieces, and he would sometimes mix oil with watercolor. And then that would just, that became a nightmare because he would lay one on top of another. And then if he tried to paint, more oil on top of dry, they would start to flake. So his palette is very interesting. Remember, at that time, this was right at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. So this is where, this is still the time where artists were mixing pigments with oils. And there were no tubes at that time. The paint tube didn't happen until much later. And I think it was like 1810 or something, I think, is when the paint tubes were invented. So it was not until 1850, I think it was, when the paint tubes were invented. So before then, he was kind of relying on the folks who mixed the paint. And he was very economical. He was very prolific. So he needed a lot of paint. And when he would go out and do his watercolors, he would kind of extend them, and he was kind of elusive about the way that he painted. He didn't tell a lot about what he mixed in the paints. So he's basically a conservator's nightmare. But like I said, to identify a Turner, you can see here it's watercolor. This is watercolor with an oil mix. You can kind of see some bits where he started with watercolor on the underneath layers. So you see that cobalt blue, and then that's all watercolor under there. And then the surface, you see the surface in the top right hand side of the painting. That's where the clouds are, is more the oil paint that you see. But he was intrigued by, again, the Industrial Revolution. This one's called the Great Western Railway, and the weather at the time. So this is a really big departure from his early works. So this is one of his works of watercolor. This is just a very straight watercolor. Nothing was added to it. And that was what he was most known for when he was going through the academy. And, he was a draftsman. If you look, you could see everything is well crafted. It's all very, very straightforward. There's not a whole lot of, abstraction or departure from what you're actually seeing. And even the composition is very strong. Over his time, he created about 30,000 of these paperworks and about 2,000 watercolors. So, and then he evolved eventually into using oil, and he made about 550 of those. So he was very prolific. Now, this is one of his most famous paintings. This is called the Fighting Temeraire Tugged to Her Last Berth to Be Broken Up, and this was done in 1839. Let's see, I have one quick thing on that. The history of this ship. So the ship was once known as one of the mightiest in the British Empire's naval fleet, and it was one that played a central role in the Battle of Trafalgar. So essentially, this is the one that defined the transition between older and more graceful wooden ships to a new era. So the fighting ships became much more, much more powerful. And then you can see there's a little steamboat right there in front of it that's seen towing this warship out to sea. It almost looks like it's fading into the distance. And it was intended to be scrapped. So, but if you look at the work, here's where he starts to take a couple liberties, and he starts to invent some of these really powerful clouds in the sky. So you can kind of tell that this was not the energy that he had in his paintings were all about this abstraction that he would create from these landscapes, and then he would bring it back to reality with these ships and with the people. So that's how you can really identify a Turner, is that you have these very big, beautiful areas, open areas of billowy clouds and land masses and big stretches of water. But then you would have these little tiny, bits of reality in there. This was his palette, which looks a lot like my palette. He was kind of a mess. He was all over the place with his paints. And I think a lot of his mixing and stuff came from what he would do, not on the surface of the painting itself, but on his palette. And then again, he took a lot of liberties of mixing, different mediums together, and that's one of the big reasons why it's really tough for a conservator to work on a Turner's painting. Here's another one, And see, this is him going farther into abstraction. And he's using his brushwork to almost make it into an action painting. So this is Snowstorm, and you can see there's a boat in there, and it's almost dark. It looks like the boat's in a lot of trouble. There's a snowstorm, there's shallow water, there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of action in the sky, and you can't even tell what is the, where's the horizon, what's the difference between the sky and the water. So this is a good example of one of the works that needed restoration. This one was called East Cow's Castle. And I guess the story went was that when it was hung in some bright light. It was hung in a very brightly lit room, and it was a habit of the cleaner to sweep the paint flakes off the floor, because they would fall onto the ground each day, and they would make an effort to sweep the paint flakes off of the floor. So restoring a piece like this is very difficult. So you can kind of see it's kind of a bad picture. I couldn't find anything closer. But to the right, you can kind of see where the frame or where the canvas is, where the canvas would meet the frame, and it would just start flaking off from the edge there. Okay, so this one is called Rockets and Blue Lights, to warn steamboats of shoal water. And a lot of work was done to restore this painting as well. So again, you can see it's a lot of abstraction going on, but you have some, you've got some indications of possibly like a smokestack back there. And then you've got some figures in the lower left-hand side. So just some indication of, again, some folks just living their lives. And this was the painting after it was restored. So look at the difference between the two. And as it went, as conservators started looking at their paintings, they discovered that Turner was trying to restore his own work, because his work would crumble even during his lifetime. And so he would try to restore his own work, and he would put layer upon layer on top of these paintings. And because of the time in between it, crumbling and him trying to restore it, that kind of made the underground unstable. And then it was up to the folks who acquired them to find restorers who would put layers of varnish over top. And that's how we ended up getting that right here, because there was a lot of layers of varnish. But then when you uncover, you take off the layer of varnish, and then you start to buff out some of these additional layers. And then you can finally get to the real color. And cobalt blue was one of his favorite colors to paint with. And you can see again, this is fully restored. Is maybe a smokestack from a ship, maybe. But you've got some flakes of paint. You can kind of see the texture of the surface of the painting. And then you can see the ground up here in the sky, and down here where he would start with just a stiff brush and put on a light wash of color to start. And then when he would build the whites on top, that was when he would use the oil paint. But look at the difference between the two. It's such a dramatic difference. And in the end, the person who did the final restoration, this was probably about 50 years ago, pretty much said how much it's been touched and retouched and retouched. They don't even know how much of that work that's left is Turner's by himself, which, kind of begs the question, do what does restoration do to a painting, and how much of the artist is still left after a restoration? Because there's good restorers and there's bad ones. Okay, so artist number 3 is Francisco de Goya, and he was born in 1746 and lived to 1828. And how do you recognize and identify a Goya? Well, he has a quote, and the quote is pretty much spot on, and he remained true to this quote throughout his life. And essentially, my art reveals idealism and truth. And you can see this is a portrait of him, and you can see his palette. I'm always, whenever I research the artist, I try to find the paint and the materials that they use. And it's always great when you have a portrait that's done with the artist, holding his palette. So how you would also identify Goya? He purchased a house near Madrid. It was called Quinta de Sordo, which was called the Villa of the Deaf Man. And essentially a deaf man lived there. But when Goya purchased it and moved in, he was also deaf. He contracted a fever. And when he moved in, the name stuck. So it continued to be Quinta del Sordo. And his most famous works were painted within the walls of this house. And they were called the Black Paintings, and they were done between 1819 and 1823. And this was when he was in his 60s and 70s. So you can kind of see that there's women laughing on the left-hand side, Judith and Holofernes, his depiction in the middle, and then Saturn eating his son or devouring his son on the right. These were all painted as murals, as frescoes inside of the villa, and then they were eventually transferred onto canvas. And one of this painting here, the Saturn devouring his son, is one that it's in the Prado, and it's pretty much the one that has the best look after the transfer onto canvas and then moved on to a wall. But you can kind of see his style. If you see this painting on the right, that's a Goya. And they were considered Black paintings because his style got really dark. He was very disillusioned about politics and everything towards the end of his life. He had been through a whole lot of conflicts, and he was a court painter. So, being in politics for a long time and being exposed to this, this is paintings that you would see towards the end of his life. Here is his actual palette. The colors that he used: lead white, yellow ochre, brown ochre, light red, burnt sienna. He had a couple different blacks, vermilion, and then some flesh tint, which was yellow ochre and lead white. So he used an array of colors, and he pretty much stuck to this palette throughout his time. So like I said, he was a court painter, and he had moved from being sort of a court painter to being the first chamber painter. And he painted this gigantic painting of the family of Carlos the Fourth, and this was done in 1800. It's oil on canvas. Here's a close-up. So you have these people and they're all very expressive. And that's another way you can identify a Goya is through the facial expressions of the figures, because they are, I mean, you can see they're all very moody in their own way. But there's Charles, there's his wife. And it's all very loosely rendered. You can also see that Goya put himself in the painting, as you have him standing in front of a canvas. He's in the background here. But what's interesting, I think, about this painting is that it has the central figure is on the compositionally. I find it very interesting because there's this triangle, this inverted triangle that's made with Charles and his wife, and I think that's a granddaughter. And that dip is what draws your attention. That triangle brings your attention down to the child almost as the focal point. But then you have these figures that are looking in different directions. You have the woman on the far right that's looking towards the group. And that's sort of where your eye starts almost, you know, or it can stop there too. So if your eyes are moving, your eye will go back to her face. That will, that will go back to her face, and her face brings your eye back to this group just by what the direction of which she's looking. And then you have the baby that's looking at her. But then you see it kind of helps you to carry your eye to the king. And then you have this woman here that's interesting. She's looking away completely. So with the revolution, he created these two paintings called the 2nd and the 3rd of May. This painting also had some trouble in the 1900s. In 1936. It was being transported with the other painting, the 2nd of May, and there was a crash, and the crash created like this really, because they were put together, created a huge impact on the destruction of these paintings, and they are very large. But this is showing the fight between the Spanish and the French. And you can kind of see there's just people from all classes fighting. So it was showing that it really was not just a war of the elite. And this was the damage that was done to the painting. This is done with the photography here. They just did an X-ray. And you can see just these, where the bars kind of where the impact hit and extended, it hit in a way where that that these stretcher bars started to poke through the painting. There were some tears. Then you've got some real big tears on the left-hand side, those big white swatches. So this was a nightmare to restore too. So you can kind of see the damage on the surface on the left. And then what was restored on the right. Again, the damage you see on the left. You can see where those patches of where the paint fell off. Do you guys see that up there? So all this on the right had to be restored. So they restored the sword that the gentleman's holding. They made some liberties on this face. You could see these lines of damage. So this was his painting, the 3rd of May, and this is one of the most famous paintings of Goya. And this was also one of those paintings that shocked the people of the time. But it depicted one of the most pivotal moments in world history. So essentially these two paintings, this one here and this one here, they were done to commemorate the events that happened in Madrid during those first few days of May of 1808. So Madrid was being invaded and overtaken by Napoleon Bonaparte. And the Spaniards that were left in Madrid, they rose up against the French in an effort to take Madrid back. And so these two works, like I said, were meant to be hung together. One depicts the events that took place on May 2nd, this one. And then the next day on May 3rd, when the French soldiers punished the leaders of the rebellion. So this painting depicts a group of Spanish men before they're executed. But look at the expressions and the crowd that's watching this happen in despair. Their hands are in, they're covering their eyes. And you have an interesting crop, which is something that more modern painters took and embraced. Degas was a really big fan of Goya's, and one of his trademark style is the fact that there's close cropping, almost to the point where you're in the scene. You can see you're not, these figures run off of the canvas. And Degas was almost a master of that. He really took and ran with that idea in his ballet paintings and some of his scenes of like the cabaret. But it really was Goya who invented the idea of the close crop and having the figures run off the canvas. Okay, Deliqua. So Deliqua lived from 1798 to 1863. And how to identify Deliqua? So they're full of emotion, exoticism, sublime, and his painting style was a lot of like agitated quick brushwork and color, lots and lots of color. This is his palette. Look how well organized it is. And this was what he said about his palette. My freshly arranged palette, brilliant with contrasting colors, is enough to fire my enthusiasm. But what I think is more interesting is looking at his palette. He has a lot of colors that normally when you set up a palette, you usually set it up, with your colors kind of going in the wheel, right? You put your lights together, your darks together, and the ones that if they mixed, it's not a problem. But if you look at his palette, look, there's complementary colors next to each other that would probably do some damage if they mix. They would probably turn a muddy color. And then there's some that repeat. So he has a couple colors that kind of repeat throughout his palette. And look at those brushes. I think the brushes are more interesting too than the palette itself, about how the stubby and coarse the hair is on the brushes. And it goes along with his style of the agitated brushwork. So he would just rub, 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 and it would sort of dissolve his brush over time, and hairs would get into the paintings and all that stuff. So almost showing that there was a lot going on just with his brushwork. So this is his painting. This was one of his most famous paintings. It's called Liberty Leading the People. And I'll take you a minute, give you a minute to digest it. Interesting composition. You have a leading female figure in the very center. And she's looking back at the crowd behind her. And she's illuminated by the smoke and the light behind her. So this is really taking on Deliqua. Also was very much influenced by the Baroque period. We talked about the Baroque period in Secretive before, where it was making having light come from the dark and illuminating a scene using light, the focal point. And here you see the focal point here is, of course, the woman holding the flag. And then your eye goes to the, to the left, and it picks up a sword that helps to bring your eye down to this gentleman's sort of sash. The gun that goes back up and to the sword that goes towards the woman. But then your eye gets brought back down by the illuminated shirt of this fallen man on the lower left-hand side. And again, this shows different class levels fighting the same war. You've got a guy who's got this top hat and he looks very fancy. And then you have gentleman on the left who, he looks like he's of a lower class. Then you have the boy that's on the right of the woman who has two guns. So it really just shows a class war, really, and the fact that this involved everyone. Here's a close-up of the painting. And you can see where this was a very large painting. I can 260 by 325 centimeters. It's I mean, we're talking feet by feet. Very large painting. Here's a close-up. And again, he was most known for color. So you can see here, he would use these very, very vibrant reds. And that's sort of a trademark within his work. And then you've got his shadows were almost painted in blues and purples. You could see like the sash of her dress. You can see those are all done with blues and purples. Really saved the blacks for last. And this almost looks like a Greek, she almost looks like a Greek goddess. So he's kind of giving a nod to classical painting. And you can kind of see, this is it within its frame. And again, you've got this, you've got these figures that run off of the canvas. And that was a really new idea at that time. And all these guys, they knew each other. And this guy just looks like, on the right-hand side, he looks like he just came from school. So kids would wear berets like this to school. And they've also said that the man on the left-hand side wearing the top coat is a self-portrait of Deliqua. So that might be him there with the top hat holding the gun. This is his other famous piece. It's called The Death of Sardinopolis. And this one's hanging in the Louvre. Another larger than life painting. And it records the suicide of this Assyrian king. It's such a gory story. So essentially what it was he's on top of this this bed, which is sort of a fire pyre, and he's going to be set aflame, but he didn't want to die without having his horses and his dogs and his women and all of his attendants there. He didn't want any sort of objects of pleasure that would outlive him. So they he had asked that they join him on the funeral pyre. And of course they resisted, so they had to be slaughtered beforehand. So you see the action that's happening in this painting. You got the man here underneath this. You see the king there in the top left-hand side. He's on top of this bed. He has a slaughtered woman along him. And then underneath, there's a gentleman who's bringing a horse up to the bed. You've got these, you've got a guy who's slaughtering this woman over here. So very gory. So when you think about these being romantics, like I said, you know, that these are ideas and these are from, you know, things from the imagination. An interpretation of, you know, again, literature and poetry of that time. And you can see the figure, this is it in the Louvre. So you can see the woman in the lower left-hand side with her purse, and she's looking up at this gigantic painting that gives you a sort of a scale of how large these paintings are. Okay, and I had to do a bonus bonus artist because in my research I found that I also really enjoy Aang. He's a fabulous painter, but I didn't realize that he was sort of like the enemy of all these other guys. He was born in 1780, lived to 1867, and him and Deliqua were always at each other's throats. Aang felt that line and being very precise with your brushwork is the only way to paint. And Deliqua said, no, it's all about color and emotion and loose brushwork. So you can see the self-portraits of both men, Aang on the left-hand side, Deliqua on the right-hand side, sort of just really establishing their style. And this is if you know, this was Aang, young Aang, and this is older Aang, and this was when they this is pretty much around the time that they had their dispute. They both exhibited at the Salon in Paris, And that's when they started to have a war of words between themselves and their styles. And just to sort of restate the differences between their styles. So you can see on the left, you got Deliqua, and he emphasized color and movement rather and making soft edges rather than, sharp outlines and forms. And again, his brushwork was very loose. And Aang on the right-hand side, this is a woman in a harem. And you could see the lines are so much sharper and precise, but yet there's still a level of abstraction because this woman, if she were actually, if she was a real woman, you would see that her back has extra bones, and her backside doesn't make sense, but he made those allowances for the aesthetic of the composition. So if she were to stand up, she would not look realistic. So on the left, there was a lot of political cartoons made about these two men. That little the picture on the left is they're dueling in front of the Institute of France. Deliqua on the left is saying line is color, and Aang on the right is saying color is utopia, long live line. But the New York Times in 1883 wrote a story about a party where these two guys had an actual confrontation, and I guess Aang was standing next to a fire. No, sorry. Deliqua was standing next to a fire. Aang saw him, and he had a cup of coffee, and he went up to him and said, "Drawing, sir, drawing is honesty. Drawing, sir, drawing is honor." And then his cup capsized and poured all over his own shirt and waistcoat. And he seized his hat in a fury and says, "This is too much. I shall go. I should not let myself be insulted any longer." So Deliqua was, he's like, oh God. So he basically said, even though he's a good painter, he says talent is apt to be exclusive. Narrowness is often the condition of its existence. And then the war was on. But just to show you how beautiful Aang's paintings are, I mean, look at how gorgeous the drapery is, and that duster that she's holding in her hand, and how the drapery is so beautifully reflective. And all the little attention to detail, like look at the detail in the duster that she's holding, and even in the in her hair. And you've got some symbols down here, just right where like the small of her back is, just underneath. You've got this pendant. You've got a pipe, I think, on the right hand side. Just beautiful. And this was another one of his most famous paintings. This is portrait of Louis Francois Bertin, and this was done in 1832. But look how, I mean, just look at the level of detail of his work. So this was sort of the contrast between these other guys who really felt, romanticism was captured with color and loose line and themes, again, themes of the things that were happening in history at the time, those revolutionary wars, this, all these conflicts, and they were in the middle of them. They were artists who were living in those spaces. And then you have Aang, it's just like, no, I'm just a good painter. And they're like, you got to stick with the plan, guy. right? All right. Well, that is my presentation on Romanticism.